It was December 6th, 1980, just 2 days before the world would lose John Lennon forever. But on this night, something happened that nobody who was there would ever forget. Something that revealed the true heart of a man the world thought they knew. The Beacon Theater in New York City was packed with 2,800 people. John Lennon hadn't performed a full concert in 5 years. 5 years of silence. 5 years of raising his son Sean. 5 years of baking bread and being a house husband while the world wondered if the music had died inside him. But tonight, he was back. And the energy was electric. John was in the middle of Imagine when a stagehand appeared in the wings, waving frantically. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. You could see it in the way he moved, in the urgency of his gestures. This wasn't a technical problem. This was something else. The song that had become an anthem for peace, the song that defined everything John believed in, suddenly felt like a prayer. And John, singing those familiar words, had no idea that in less than 60 seconds, everything was about to change. Imagine all the people living life in peace. The stagehand was now at the edge of the stage, holding a folded piece of paper. His face was pale. His hands were shaking. And when John's eyes finally met his, something passed between them. A understanding. The dread. John stopped singing. The band, confused, gradually stopped playing. 2,800 people held their breath, sensing that this wasn't part of the show. This was real life breaking through the performance. This was the moment when the stage could no longer protect anyone from the truth. What happened next would become one of the most powerful moments in rock and roll history. But to understand why John Lennon made the decision he did, you have to understand the woman who raised him. The woman who shaped him. The woman whose death was written on that folded piece of paper. Her name was Mimi Smith, and she was about to change John's final concert forever. Mimi Smith wasn't John's mother. She was something more complicated than that, something deeper. When John was 5 years old, his mother Julia couldn't take care of him anymore. The reasons were messy, painful, the kind of family trauma that shapes a child forever. So Mimi, Julia's older sister, took John into her home at 251 Menlove Avenue in Liverpool. The house called Mendips. Mimi was strict, proper, middle-class British in every sense. She believed in discipline, education, and respectability. She did not believe in rock and roll. She especially did not believe that her nephew should waste his life playing guitar when he could be doing something useful. "The guitar's all very well, John," she would say in that clipped Liverpool accent, "but you'll never make a living out of it." John never forgot those words. Years later, when he bought her a house, he had a silver plaque made with that exact quote engraved on it. He hung it in her living room. His way of saying, "You were wrong, Auntie Mimi, but I love you anyway." Because despite her severity, despite her disapproval of his music, despite everything, Mimi loved John fiercely. She fed him, clothed him, sent him to school, and gave him the stability his mother couldn't provide. And John, in his complicated way, loved her back. When John's mother Julia was killed by a drunk driver in 1958, struck down just outside Mimi's house, it was Mimi who held John as he sobbed. It was Mimi who helped him survive the grief that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Mother, friend, warden, protector. Mimi was all of these things. By 1980, Mimi was 74 years old, living in a seaside bungalow in Poole, England, that John had bought for her. They spoke on the phone regularly. He would tell her about Sean, about baking bread, about his quiet life in the Dakota building. She would tell him about her garden, her neighbors, her health. Her health, that was the problem. Mimi had been sick for weeks, pneumonia. At 74, pneumonia is never just pneumonia. John knew this. He'd been planning to fly to England to see her after the holidays, after this comeback performance, after he'd proven to himself and the world that he could still do this. But now, standing on stage at the Beacon Theater, with 2,800 people staring at him in confused silence, John unfolded that piece of paper and read 5 words that stopped his heart. Mimi passed away. 6:40 p.m. GMT. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like that helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. The paper trembled in John's hands. 2,800 people watched him read those 5 words. Read them again, and then fold the paper carefully, slowly, like he was trying to fold away the truth itself. The Beacon Theater was dead silent. You could hear the heating system. You could hear someone cough in the balcony. You could hear John breathing into the microphone, each breath ragged and uneven. Yoko was backstage, watching on a monitor. She knew immediately what had happened. She'd received the same call 20 minutes earlier. She'd made the decision not to tell John until after the show. Let him have this moment. Let him have this comeback. Let him finish what he started. But the stagehand, new to the crew, didn't know the plan. He thought John needed to know immediately. He thought this was the right thing to do. Now John stood at the center of the stage, holding that folded paper, facing the biggest decision of the night. Maybe the biggest decision of his comeback. He could walk off. Nobody would blame him. His aunt, the woman who raised him, had just died. Of course he should leave. Of course the show should end. Everyone would understand. Or he could continue. He could push through the grief, finish the performance, deal with the loss later in private, the way famous people are supposed to do. But John Lennon had never done what he was supposed to do. And what he decided in that moment revealed something essential about who he was. Something the world needed to see. John walked to the edge of the stage. He looked out at the sea of faces, all of them worried, confused, waiting. And then he spoke. My Aunt Mimi just died. His voice was flat, factual, the Liverpool accent thicker now, the way it always got when he was emotional. She raised me. From the time I was 5 years old, she didn't want me to be a musician. She wanted me to be respectable. He gave a short, bitter laugh. I disappointed her in that regard. A few nervous laughs from the audience, but mostly silence. Heavy, respectful silence. I haven't performed in 5 years. 5 years of being quiet, being a dad, being normal. And Mimi, she approved of that. She finally thought I was doing something sensible with my life. John paused, looking down at the paper in his hand. She died tonight while I was on this stage. Died while I was doing the one thing she never quite approved of. There's an irony in that, isn't there? More silence. Someone in the front row was crying. I could leave right now. I could go backstage, get on a plane, fly to England. But Mimi's already gone. And you know what she'd say if she could see me now? She'd say, John, you made a commitment. You finish what you start. That's what respectable people do. John looked up, and there were tears streaming down his face. Not hiding them, not wiping them away, just letting them fall. So I'm going to finish this show. I'm going to play every song I promised you. And I'm going to dedicate every single one to Mimi Smith, who never quite understood what I did, but loved me anyway. The audience erupted, not with cheers or applause, but with something deeper, a collective release of emotion. People were on their feet, crying, reaching toward the stage. Not because they were fans of John Lennon, but because they'd just witnessed something brutally human. What John did next shocked everyone even more. This song, John said, his voice still thick with tears, is called Mother. If you know anything about John Lennon's music, you know that Mother is not an easy song. It's not a crowd pleaser. It's raw, primal, therapeutic. A scream of abandonment and loss that John had recorded in 1970 during his most intense period of primal scream therapy. The song that starts with a funeral bell. The song that ends with John screaming, "Mama, don't go, Daddy, come home," over and over until his voice breaks. And now, minutes after learning his aunt had died, John was going to perform it. The piano began. Simple, haunting chords. John sat down, closed his eyes, and began to sing. "Mother, you had me, but I never had you." His voice was different tonight. Rawer, more vulnerable. Every word seemed to cost him something. "I wanted you. You didn't want me." The audience was transfixed. This wasn't a performance anymore. This was witnessing someone process grief in real time. This was therapy, conducted in front of 2,800 strangers. "Father, you left me, but I never left you." John's voice cracked. He gripped the microphone stand so hard his knuckles went white. "I needed you. You didn't need me." And then came the final verse, the one about children. The one that took on devastating new meaning tonight. "Children, don't do what I have done." John opened his eyes, looked straight into the audience, and sang the next line like a confession. "I couldn't walk, and I tried to run." The band behind him was crying. The audience was crying. Yoko, watching backstage, was crying. Even the hardened stage crew, men who'd seen thousands of shows, were wiping their eyes. Then came the ending, the screaming, the part where John would unleash everything. But tonight, he didn't scream. Instead, he stopped, held the silence, and then spoke directly to the audience. "Mimi would have hated this song. She would have told me to stop making such a fuss. Stop being so emotional. Be respectable. Be proper. Be British." He smiled through the tears. "But this is how I grieve. This is how I say goodbye. With noise, with honesty, with everything I am." John stood up from the piano, walked to center stage, and then, for the first time all night, he screamed. Not the words of the song, just sound, pure animal grief. The kind of sound that comes from somewhere deeper than music, deeper than performance. The audience didn't clap, they didn't cheer, they just absorbed it, held space for it. Let John Lennon be completely, devastatingly human in front of them. When the scream ended, John wiped his face with his sleeve and said quietly, "Thank you. Thank you for letting me do that." What followed was the most emotionally powerful concert anyone in that theater had ever witnessed. John played for 2 more hours. He played Beatles songs and solo songs. He played hits and deep cuts. He talked between every song about Mimi, about loss, about family, about the complicated love between a nephew and the aunt who raised him. He told stories, funny ones about Mimi's disapproval of his hair, his clothes, his friends. Sad ones about the day she took him in, the day his mother died, the last conversation they'd had 3 days ago. "She asked me if I was eating properly," John said with a bitter laugh. "I'm 40 years old, and she's still asking if I'm eating properly." The audience laughed and cried with him. They became part of his grieving process, witnesses to something sacred. But the most powerful moment came near the end of the show. It was nearly midnight. John had been on stage for over 2 hours. His voice was hoarse, his face was streaked with tears and sweat, but he showed no signs of stopping. "I want to tell you something," John said, sitting down on the edge of the stage, his legs dangling over the side. "Something I've never said publicly before." The audience leaned forward. Even the people in the back of the balcony seemed to move closer. "When my mother died, I was 17. She was hit by a car right outside Mimi's house. One minute she was there, and the next she was gone. And I hated Mimi for it." Silence. Heavy, uncomfortable silence. I hated her because she was alive and my mother was dead. I hated her because she was strict and proper, and Julia was fun and free. I hated her because she represented everything my mother wasn't. And for years, I punished her for being alive. John's voice was shaking now. I was cruel to her. I'd call her late at night, drunk, and tell her it should have been her who died instead of Julia. I'd ignore her birthday. I'd forget to call at Christmas. I'd buy her expensive things instead of giving her what she actually wanted, which was just me. My time, my attention, my love. Someone in the front row gasped. This was too intimate, too raw. But John kept going. And she took it, all of it, every cruel word, every forgotten holiday, every expensive gift that was really just guilt wrapped in paper. She took it, and she never stopped loving me. John wiped his eyes. 2 years ago, I finally apologized. I called her and I said, Mimi, I'm sorry. For everything. For being a terrible nephew. For blaming you for things that weren't your fault. For not appreciating what you did for me. And you know what she said? John looked up at the audience, his face illuminated by the stage lights. She said, Oh, John, don't be silly. You're my boy. You've always been my boy. Nothing you could do would ever change that. The theater was silent, except for the sound of hundreds of people crying. And I believed her. For the first time in my life, I believed that someone could love me unconditionally. Not because I was John Lennon, not because I was famous, but because I was hers, her boy. John stood up slowly, his body seeming to carry an enormous weight. I wasted so many years being angry at her, being resentful, being cruel, and now she's gone, and I can't apologize again. I can't call her tomorrow and tell her I love her. I can't buy her another expensive gift that means nothing. All I can do is stand here and tell all of you, don't wait. Don't wait to forgive. Don't wait to love. Don't wait to say the things that matter, because you think you'll have more time. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. You won't. Trust me, you won't. What John did next became the stuff of legend. He asked the entire audience to take out paper and pen. If they didn't have any, he had his crew distribute them. And he asked everyone to write down the name of someone they needed to forgive, someone they needed to call, someone they needed to tell they loved. Don't wait until they're dead, John said. Do it now. Tonight. When you leave this theater, make that call, write that letter, have that conversation, because I promise you, the regret of waiting is worse than the discomfort of honesty. For 10 minutes, 2,800 people sat in the Beacon Theater writing names on scraps of paper. Some people wrote one name, some wrote dozens. Some just sat there crying, overwhelmed by the weight of their own regrets. John watched them all, and for a moment, he wasn't a rock star. He was just another person carrying the burden of love and loss. The concert ended at 1:30 a.m., 3.5 hours after it was supposed to. John played every song he'd promised, and more. He sang Beatles hits that he'd sworn he'd never perform again. He sang solo songs that were too painful to revisit. He sang covers of songs that Mimi used to hum around the house when he was a child. But the most remarkable thing wasn't the music. It was the atmosphere John had created. The Beacon Theater had become a church, a confessional, a space where grief and love and regret could exist together without shame. People didn't want to leave. Even after the house lights came up, they stayed in their seats, holding their pieces of paper with names written on them, reluctant to return to the world where their losses and regrets were waiting. John stood on stage, exhausted, drained, empty, but also somehow lighter. He'd done something he'd never done before. He'd shared his grief instead of bottling it up. He'd let strangers see him at his most vulnerable, and in doing so, he'd given them permission to be vulnerable too. Backstage, Yoko held him for a long time without saying anything. What was there to say? They'd been together long enough that words weren't always necessary. "I need to call Sean," John finally said. "I need to tell him about Mimi before someone else does." It was 2 a.m. in New York, which meant it was 7 a.m. in England. Sean would be waking up for school. John went to the backstage phone and dialed his apartment at the Dakota. "Hello?" Sean's sleepy voice. "Hey, buddy, it's Dad." "Dad, how was the show?" John's voice cracked. "It was good, Sean, really good. But I need to tell you something." He explained about Mimi, about getting the news on stage, about the choice he'd made to continue performing. Sean, only 5 years old, asked the question that cut straight to the heart of everything. "Are you sad, Daddy?" "Yeah, buddy, I'm really sad." "Did you cry?" "I did, in front of a lot of people." "That's okay," Sean said with the simple wisdom of children. "Aunt Mimi wouldn't want you to be sad for too long. She'd want you to make music." John closed his eyes. Out of the mouths of babes. "You're right, Sean. You're absolutely right." After hanging up, John made a decision that would define his final days. He decided to fly to England immediately. Not to attend Mimi's funeral. That wouldn't happen for several days. But to go to her house, to sit in the rooms where she'd lived, to say goodbye in his own way. But before he left New York, he did something unexpected. He went back out into the empty Beacon Theater. The crew was breaking down the stage. The cleaning staff was sweeping up. The theater was returning to its normal state, as if the extraordinary events of the evening had never happened. John walked onto the dark stage, sat down at the piano, and played Imagine one more time, alone, quietly, as a private goodbye to the woman who'd never quite understood his music, but had loved him anyway. The cleaning staff stopped working. The crew stopped breaking down equipment. They all just listened to John Lennon playing for an audience of nobody, playing for himself, playing for Mimi. When he finished, he stood up, walked to the edge of the stage, and looked out at the empty seats. "Thank you, Mimi," he said to the darkness, "for everything." And then he left. John Lennon flew to England the next morning. He spent 3 days in Mimi's bungalow in Poole, going through her things, reading old letters, looking at photographs of himself as a child. He found a scrapbook she'd kept of every article ever written about him, even the negative ones, especially the negative ones. On one particularly scathing review from 1964, calling the Beatles talentless noisemakers, Mimi had written in the margin, "Wrong. My John has more talent in his little finger." It made him laugh and cry at the same time. He also found letters he'd written to her over the years, drunken, cruel letters from the 1970s that he'd assumed she'd thrown away. But she'd kept them all, filed carefully in chronological order, his cruelty preserved like pressed flowers. At her funeral, John didn't speak publicly, but he sang, quietly at the graveside. He sang In My Life, the Beatles song that was really about her, about Liverpool, about the places and people that shaped him. "There are places I remember all my life, though some have changed." The small gathering of Mimi's friends and neighbors listened to John Lennon sing at his aunt's funeral, and they understood that they were witnessing something rare. Not a performance, a prayer. 2 days later, John returned to New York. He seemed different, quieter, more present. Yoko noticed it immediately. Sean noticed it too. "Daddy's sad," Sean told a friend, "but he's also more here." John spent his final days in December 1980 being fully present, playing with Sean, talking to Yoko, planning new music, making phone calls to old friends he'd fallen out of touch with, living like someone who understood that time was precious. On December 8, 1980, just 2 days after returning from England, John Lennon was shot and killed outside the Dakota Building by Mark David Chapman. The world mourned. Millions of people grieved for a man they'd never met. But the 2,800 people who'd been at the Beacon Theater that night grieved differently. They grieved for the man they'd seen, the vulnerable, honest, broken, beautiful human being who'd chosen to share his pain instead of hiding it. Many of them still had those pieces of paper, the ones with names written on them, names of people they needed to forgive, to call, to love, before it was too late. And in the days and weeks after John's death, those pieces of paper became sacred, reminders that John Lennon's final message wasn't "Imagine" or "Give Peace a Chance" or any of his famous songs. His final message was simpler: don't wait. The bootleg recording of that Beacon Theater concert became one of the most sought-after pieces of Lennon memorabilia. Not because of the music quality. It was recorded on someone's cheap cassette player, but because you can hear everything on it. John's voice breaking, the audience crying, the raw, unfiltered humanity of a man processing grief in real time. Music historians call it the most honest performance in rock and roll history. A moment when the barrier between performer and audience disappeared completely. But perhaps the most remarkable legacy of that night is what happened after. Musicians started talking more openly about grief and loss. Concerts became spaces where vulnerability was welcomed, not hidden. The idea that performers had to be invulnerable began to crack. John Lennon showed 2,800 people that it was okay to break down. That grief didn't have to be private. That sharing pain didn't make you weak, it made you human. In 2010, on the 30th anniversary of John's death, a group of people who'd been at that Beacon Theater concert organized a gathering. They came from all over the world, and they each brought their piece of paper, the one with the name written on it. Some of those names belong to people who are now deceased. Some belong to people who'd been forgiven and reconciled with. Some belong to people still waiting for a call that never came. They shared stories about what happened when they made those calls, the relationships that were healed, the conversations that changed everything, the regrets that were resolved before it was too late. And they talked about John Lennon, not as a legend or an icon, but as the man who gave them permission to be honest, to be vulnerable, to not wait. One woman stood up and said something that everyone in that room felt. John Lennon taught me that the bravest thing you can do is break down in front of strangers, because maybe they need permission to break down too. Today, at the Beacon Theater in New York, there's a small plaque backstage that reads, December 6th, 1980. John Lennon performed here. He received news of his aunt's death and chose to continue. In doing so, he taught us that grief shared is grief survived. Don't wait to love. Don't wait to forgive. Don't wait. And every performer who sees that plaque, every musician who stands on that stage, carries forward the lesson of that night. The most powerful performances aren't about perfection. They're about truth. John Lennon's final concert wasn't his best. His voice cracked. He cried. He forgot lyrics. He stopped mid-song to talk about loss and regret. But it was his most important, because on that December night, just 2 days before his death, John Lennon showed the world what it means to be completely, courageously, devastatingly human. And in doing so, he gave us one final gift: the understanding that our grief, our pain, our vulnerability, these aren't weaknesses to hide. They're the truest songs we'll ever sing. If this story moved you, if it made you think about someone you need to call, someone you need to forgive, someone you need to tell you love, don't wait. Do it now. Leave a comment telling us who that person is, and subscribe to this channel for more untold stories about the moments that reveal who we really are. Hit that like button if John Lennon's courage inspired you. And remember, we're all just human beings trying to make sense of loss and love and time that passes too quickly. The legend may be gone, but the lessons remain. Don't wait. Never wait.